I never thought I'd be the guy sitting alone, nursing a whiskey in a dim apartment, trying to piece together the final days of my best friend's life. It's not a place anyone plans to end up, but life has a way of sneaking up on you like that. His name was Nick, a guy who seemed to defy the rules we all played by. Before 25, Nick had everything most people dream of. A job that made others envious, a sleek car that purred like it belonged in a movie, and a house so big it made me wonder if he was secretly royalty. Women adored him. Friends flocked to him. Now, at 30, Nick had even more than someone could imagine. He didn't have a full-time job anymore. He instead was an entrepreneur, an angel investor who dabbled in everything from finance to small business, all earning him money and equally successful in their own right. Nick's girlfriend, Amanda, was a total smoke show and a supermodel. It was like everything he touched turned to gold, and he himself was made of gold. He was untouchable, until he wasn't. The cracks started showing about 6 months before he died. Subtle at first. He'd miss calls or texts for days, and then reappear with flimsy excuses and dark circles under his eyes. The Nick who once charged into life with reckless confidence began to retreat into himself, darting his eyes around rooms like someone was watching him. I didn't think much of it at first. Nick had always been an enigma, prone to bouts of eccentricity that were equal parts infuriating and endearing. But then he started coming to my apartment, my rundown, barely livable space, almost nightly. It didn't make sense. He had a house that could have swallowed my apartment 5 times over, yet he chose my peeling walls and creaky floors. When he came over, he'd talk, but only in fragments. He wanted to say something, to unload some massive burden, but every time he got close, he'd stop. "You wouldn't get it," he'd say, running his hands through his hair. "You'd think I was crazy." Then he started to get sick. It began with whispers. His girlfriend said she hadn't heard from him in days. His car sat untouched in his driveway. Even his housekeeper, the one constant in his life, said he hadn't been home. A week passed, then another, no word. When he finally resurfaced, I barely recognized him. Nick, the guy who once seemed larger than life, looked like a shadow of himself. His skin had a grayish pallor, his cheekbones jutted out sharply, and his clothes hung off him like he'd shrunk 3 sizes. His eyes, those had changed the most. They weren't just tired. They were haunted. That night, he told me everything. He slumped into the old armchair in my living room, his voice trembling as he whispered, "Before I tell you this, you need to believe in something bigger than yourself. It doesn't have to be God, but it has to be something." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. "Nick, what are you talking about?" He stared at me for a long moment, like he was weighing whether to trust me. "I'm a Freemason," he said finally. "I've been one for years." I blinked, confused. "Aren't those the guys who wear aprons and talk about charity?" Nick's laugh was hollow. "That's what they want you to think. But that's just the surface. Once you're in, really in, it's different." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I moved up the ranks fast, faster than most. They said I was chosen, that I had potential. At first it was great. The connections, the money, the power. It was everything they promised and more. But it comes at a cost. "What cost?" I asked, my heart pounding. Nick hesitated, his hands trembling. "You have to give them everything. Your loyalty, your time, your soul. And if you don't play by their rules..." He trailed off, his eyes darting to the window like he expected someone to be there. "They take it back. All of it." I didn't know what to say. Nick wasn't the type to believe in conspiracies or supernatural nonsense. But the fear in his eyes was real. And then he said something that sent chills down my spine. "It's not just them. It's what they're connected to. What they worship. You wouldn't believe me if I told you." I wanted to laugh it off, to tell him he was being paranoid. But something in his voice made it impossible to dismiss. He wasn't just scared. He was broken. That night, Nick told me everything. And once you hear it, you'll never look at the world the same way again. Nick leaned forward, his face gaunt and pale under the dim light of my old lamp. His voice dropped to a whisper, and his eyes darted toward the window again, as if he expected someone, or something, to be watching. "It started with the rituals," he said. "Simple stuff at first. Symbols, chants, handshakes. Harmless, right? Just tradition. But as I climbed the ranks, things got darker. More serious. They'd talk about enlightenment, about unlocking ancient knowledge, building good men. At first I thought it was all metaphorical. Some philosophical mumbo-jumbo. He paused, rubbing his temples as if the memories themselves hurt to recall. But it's not, he said, his voice trembling. It's not a metaphor. The higher you go, the more you realize it's real. All of it, the symbols, the rituals, the oaths, they're not just for show. They're a calling. An offering. I frowned. An offering to what? Some kind of god? Nick shook his head slowly, his eyes unfocused, like he was seeing something far away. Not a god, not in the way you're thinking. It's ancient, powerful. They call it the architect. At first, it seems benevolent, like it's just about order, progress, and control. But the deeper you go, the more you realize it's hungry. Hungry? I echoed, not sure if I wanted him to keep going. He nodded, his hands gripping the arms of the chair until his knuckles turned white. Hungry for devotion, for submission, for pieces of you. They call it sacrifices, but it's not what you think. It's not about blood or death, not at first anyway. It starts with small things. Energy, focus, but as you rise, they want more. They want your soul, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but obedience. I stared at him, unsure if I was more scared of his words or the absolute certainty in his voice. Nick, this sounds insane. Are you sure you're not losing it? He cut in, his voice sharp. I wish I were. I wish this was some kind of breakdown. But it's not. I've seen things, man. Things I can't explain. People who shouldn't be alive. Places that don't exist on any map. And the things they do in those places. His voice trailed off, and he shuddered. What happened to you? I asked, my throat dry. Why are you telling me this now? Nick slumped back in the chair, his body sagging as if the weight of his story had finally crushed him. Because I broke the rules. I asked too many questions. I refused to do what they wanted. And now they're taking everything back. My health, my money, my life. They don't just let you leave. They either destroy you or use you as an example. And I think I'm next. The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the fridge. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know if I believed him. But the fear in his eyes was undeniable. Nick, I said finally, why me? Why are you telling me this? He looked at me then, his eyes wide and pleading. Because you're the only one I trust. You're the only one who can tell my story when I'm gone. People need to know. They need to understand what's really out there. I opened my mouth to respond, but a sudden noise cut me off. A faint tapping sound, like knuckles rapping on glass. Nick's head snapped toward the window, and his face went ashen. They've found me, he whispered, his voice barely audible. It's too late. Before I could react, Nick shot to his feet and bolted toward the door. Don't let them get to you, he yelled over his shoulder. Stay out of it, no matter what. And then he was gone, disappearing into the night. That was the last time I saw Nick alive. 3 days later, they found his body in his house, hanging from the rafters. The police called it a suicide. But I knew better. The first few days after Nick's funeral were eerily quiet. Too quiet. I told myself the silence was normal. Grief takes up space, fills the room with its heavy presence. But then the oddities began. It started with a package, a small brown box left on my doorstep, unmarked and anonymous. Inside was a book, an old, worn copy of The Architecture of the Universe. I flipped through the pages, expecting it to be a dry textbook, but the margins were filled with handwritten notes. Strange symbols, cryptic phrases. Some words had been underlined so many times the paper was worn thin. Nick's handwriting. I shoved the book into a drawer, my stomach knotting. Maybe he'd left it for me before he died. But why and why now? I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that someone else had sent it. But coincidences don't make your chest tighten like that. By the second week, I started noticing things that felt off. I'd come home from work to find my front door unlocked, though I was certain I'd locked it before leaving. The curtains in my living room seemed to shift positions, even though I never touched them. Small, insignificant details. Things I tried to explain away. It's just your mind playing tricks, I told myself. But my mind wasn't the one moving my coffee mug to the edge of the counter when I always left it in the sink. The unease was worst at night. I'd wake up in the early hours, drenched in sweat, with the feeling that someone had been in the room. Once I thought I heard faint footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. I didn't have the courage to investigate. The dream started as it always did, Nick standing in my apartment looking gaunt and pale. He wasn't speaking, but his eyes were fixed on the couch. This time, though, the dream continued. I knelt down, feeling a strange compulsion to check under the couch. My hands trembled as I reached beneath it and pulled out a small wooden box. It was unmarked, smooth to the touch. I opened it to find Nick's pocket watch, gleaming like it had been polished yesterday. In the dream, I heard Nick's voice behind me. "They're watching you." I turned to look at him, but his face had changed, distorted, hollow. His eyes weren't his anymore. They glowed with a faint, otherworldly light. I woke up gasping, the sound of Nick's voice echoing in my head. The oddities became more noticeable. The barista at the coffee shop asked me, "How's the new watch working out?" I froze. "What watch?" She smiled, like she'd caught me in a lie. "The pocket watch. You've had it with you every morning this week." I hadn't. Another time, a man I'd never met stopped me on the street. He was older, dressed in a gray overcoat, with a slight stoop to his posture. As he passed, he muttered, "You shouldn't have looked in the book." I stopped, turning to call after him, but he disappeared into the crowd before I could respond. And then there was the note. A scrap of paper slid under my door one night. Just 4 words scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. "They are always near." It wasn't until the 5th week that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I found the pocket watch, not in a dream but in reality. It was sitting on my kitchen counter one morning, gleaming in the pale light of dawn. My hands shook as I picked it up. It was unmistakably Nick's. The same intricate engravings, the same weight. I turned it over, expecting to see the inscription he always showed off. Tempus vincit omnia. But the words were gone. The back of the watch was blank, as if the inscription had never existed. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, the air in the room growing heavier with every passing second. When I finally set it down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just crossed some invisible line. The watch was back the next morning. This time, it was in my coat pocket. Nothing felt real anymore. Not my apartment, not my job, not the world outside. Every day, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Like unseen eyes were tracking my every move. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. Nick's story didn't end with his death. It was only beginning, and somehow I was now a part of it. By the 6th week, the unease turned into a full-blown paranoia. My phone stopped ringing. No calls from friends or family. Even spam calls disappeared. My inbox, usually cluttered with junk emails, went silent. I tried calling out, but every number I dialed just rang endlessly, or returned with a robotic, "This number is no longer in service." The world seemed to shrink around me, leaving only my apartment and the creeping dread that now felt like a constant companion. And then one night, everything changed. It was a stormy evening, thunder rolling in the distance as rain lashed against the windows. I was sitting on the couch, the pocket watch clutched in my hand. It had become a strange kind of talisman for me, something to hold on to, even if it scared me. The power went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the watch in my hand. Then I heard it. Steps, not in the hallway outside. Inside the apartment. They were slow, deliberate, the sound of heavy boots on my creaky wooden floor. I froze, barely breathing, as the steps moved closer. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, my voice trembling. No response. The footsteps stopped just behind me. I could feel the presence, cold and oppressive, like a shadow had come alive and wrapped itself around me. I turned, heart pounding, and saw nothing. The room was empty, but then the whispering started. "You shouldn't have kept the watch." The voice was low, guttural, and it wasn't coming from one direction. It was all around me. The walls seemed to hum with it, vibrating with an energy I couldn't comprehend. The pocket watch grew hot in my hand, and I dropped it with a yelp. It hit the floor, and the ticking stopped. Everything went silent. And then, the door to my apartment creaked open. The figures stood in the doorway, their silhouette illuminated by a faint, unnatural glow. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching me. It was the same figure I'd seen weeks ago, the dark coat, the wide-brimmed hat. But now up close, I could see the details. Their face was shrouded in shadow, but their eyes glowed with a cold, otherworldly light. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice breaking. They stepped forward, and with each step, the air grew heavier, like the room was being compressed into a singularity. "You've seen too much," they said, their voice resonating like a choir of whispers. "You hold what was his. What is ours?" I backed away, my hands shaking. "I don't want it. Take it back." The figure tilted their head, almost curious. "It does not matter what you want. The choice was never yours to make." I stumbled over the coffee table, falling to the floor. The pocket watch lay just out of reach, its once familiar ticking now replaced by an unnatural hum. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. They knelt down, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the room. "To serve," they said simply. "As he did, as you will." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm not like him. I didn't ask for this." The figure loomed over me, their glowing eyes drilling into my soul. The air was so thick I could barely breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to fight, to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, pinned by something far greater than fear. "You resist," the figure said, their voice resonating like a low, distant thunder. "But resistance is futile. You have already been chosen." "I didn't ask for this," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You were marked by proximity," they replied, their tone cold, detached. "The watch, the knowledge, the bond you shared with him, it has sealed your place." And then they extended their hand. At first I thought they were going to harm me, but instead they simply waited, their palm open and empty. A strange sense of calm washed over me, pushing back the fear, replacing it with curiosity. "What happens if I say yes?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. The figure's head tilted, as if they were amused. "You will know power beyond measure, success without question. You will rise as he rose, but you will serve, always." The words echoed in my mind, "You will rise." For weeks, I'd been consumed by terror, by the thought that I'd inherited Nick's curse. But as I knelt there, staring at that outstretched hand, I realized something I hadn't admitted to myself before. Nick's life, for all its mystery and eventual collapse, had been extraordinary. The money, the connections, the influence, it had all been real. And now, that power was being offered to me. I thought of my own life, the dead-end job, the rundown apartment, the endless monotony. "What if I refuse?" I asked, already knowing the answer. The figure's voice grew colder. "Then you will lose everything. Your life, your sanity, your very existence will be forfeit." The architect does not take lightly to rejection. I closed my eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. When Nick had told me his story, I'd thought he was crazy. Now I understood. The world isn't what it seems. The people at the top, the ones who seem untouchable, unstoppable, they've all made the same choice. And now it was my turn. The figure leaned closer, and for the first time, I could make out a hint of their face. Pale, featureless, like a blank canvas. "It is already done." The room seemed to implode, the walls folding in on themselves as the figure reached for me. The pocket watch flew into their hand, and as they closed their fingers around it, I felt a searing pain in my chest, as if they were pulling something from me. I reached out, my hand trembling, and placed it in theirs. The moment our hands touched, a surge of energy coursed through me. It wasn't painful, it was exhilarating. I felt my heart race, my mind expand, my body hum with a power I couldn't describe. My vision blurred, and the last thing I heard was their voice, low and resonant. "Welcome to the fold." The room around me dissolved into darkness, and for a moment I felt weightless, untethered. Images flashed before my eyes. Wealth, power, success, everything I'd ever wanted, but never thought I could have. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of my apartment. The lights were back on, the rain had stopped, and everything looked normal, except it wasn't. The pocket watch was gone, but in its place was a symbol etched into the floor, a perfect replica of the strange markings from the book Nick had left me. I stared at it, my heart racing, as a single thought echoed in my mind. This isn't over. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of waiting. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. I was promoted at work, out of nowhere, offered a position I wasn't even qualified for. My bank account, which had always been dangerously close to empty, was suddenly flush with money. Opportunities seemed to fall into my lap. Clients seeking me out, people bending over backward to accommodate me. My confidence grew. My circle expanded. People I'd never met before seemed to know my name, eager to connect, to be close to me. It was intoxicating. At night, I still dreamed of Nick. But now the dreams were different. He didn't look gaunt or afraid anymore. He looked proud. He stood in the distance watching me, a faint smile on his lips. I knew what I'd become. I'd stepped into the role he'd left behind, taken the power he'd once held. And for the first time in my life, I felt alive. Of course, there were sacrifices. The architect demanded loyalty, and I gave it. Sometimes they asked for things I didn't fully understand. A meeting with a stranger, a signature on a contract, a quiet word in the right ear. I didn't question it. I'd learned my lesson. The power wasn't free, but it was worth the cost. As I stood on the balcony of my new penthouse one evening, staring out at the city below, I thought of Nick again. Of his paranoia, his fear. He'd fought the system, tried to resist. I wouldn't make the same mistake. Some people are meant to serve. Others are meant to rise. And I had chosen to rise.